Texting.
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 Texting. Texting. Texting. Texting. Texting.
Texting.
Texting.
Mark, Will, and Tomek present
Texting.
Hello, all you textual deviants, and welcome to another episode of Texting. I'm Mark Will in Taipei.
And I'm Tomek in Siete Stefan, Montenegro.
Montenegro! You were there last time, were you not?
I was a bit further south on the coast in a place called Ulcinj, which was very close to Albania. Now I'm a bit further north in a quite posh resort city close to the more gauche. Can you tell me how to pronounce that word?
Gauche?
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, I would say gauche.
Okay, I'm quite close to the gauche southern Spain vibe resort city of Budva.
Mm-hmm.
I just compare it to one of those places, you know, that gets like flocks of English tourists in southern Spain, or the worst that Thailand has to offer in terms of Budva. But where I am, it's more tranquil, more picturesque, and got a great view of the Adriatic Sea.
Okay.
So yeah, last wing of this vacation. Is that the word I'm looking for?
Last leg.
Last leg. Thank you.
That's kind of like a wing.
Yeah. Last leg of this particular leg. Last leg of this leg of the holiday. And then on Friday, I don't know if I told you this, but I'm going to Rome for probably a week or so. I'm still waiting. I'm still basically just filling this period as I wait for the Russian visa to be cleared. So.
Oh, how long does that take?
Well, again, it's just kind of delay after delay. So.
Oh,
right
there's
now,
no time frame. They just let you know when.
There are time frames, but the time frame comes and goes, and they find another issue. So right now, it's looking like I need to be in the UK by the 19th. So
okay.
That's my next step. And yeah, my buddy Robert, shout outs to Robert, just had a kid, his first in Rome with his partner Chiara. I think you met Robert actually on one of my trivia shows.
Okay.
Yeah, he was the guy who also knew about classic rock. And
oh,
I
yeah.
can't remember. Yeah.
Yeah. Hey there, Robert.
Yeah, so...
I know you're listening.
So yeah. Yeah, so he's just had his kid. I'm going to go stay with him for a while, and yeah. Should be good. I love Italy.
Yeah.
Always good to get some Italian food in. Yeah, man. And
Excellent.
You? Any life updates you want to tell our audience about?
Oh, I'm just finishing edits on my forthcoming book, Earnest Games. And
Awesome.
I'm composing, I guess you could say, another travelogue, trying to finish that up as well.
That's about a trip you've already done, though.
Yeah, it's about a trip to the so-called Holy Land. I went to Israel, Palestine in 2014 during
Nice.
the war, the asymmetrical war. So
You mean the special military operation?
yeah, that one. So I'm writing a book called Pilgrimizing. And,
Interesting.
yeah, hopefully I'll finish that this summer, but I need to get Earnest Games out first.
What does the title mean, Pilgrimizing?
Well, I mean, it's used facetiously, but Mark Twain in his The Innocents Abroad coined that term, pilgrimizing. So I've lifted it from him. I mean,
Okay.
I don't want to get into it now, but basically I'm writing from the perspective of a Phoenician, Cadmus the Phoenician in particular. So, you know, I consider myself a descendant of the Phoenicians, at least spiritually. So the so-called Holy Land is really my people's land, which was taken over later by the monotheists, the Jews, Christians, and Muslims. But
Okay.
my perspective is that of one of the a spiritual descendant of one of the original inhabitants of that so-called Holy Land.
Nice. So
Does that make sense?
This is your Ziggy Stardust alter ego.
Well, one of them, like the artist we're featuring today, David Bowie. I have many personae.
Very nice.
So, speaking of Bowie, should we get into it?
Let's do it, man.
Okay, our topic today is David Bowie's Berlin Trilogy. And before I should say that when we're talking about Bowie's Berlin Trilogy, we mean 3 albums, Low, Heroes, and Lodger. But before we start talking about each album individually, I want to pause for a minute and talk about... Actually, we're not pausing. I want to step back for a moment and consider the significance of the trilogy. If we paused, we would stop talking altogether, right? We don't want that. This is a podcast. We got to keep it going. Make it snappy.
Absolutely.
Make it entertaining. Make it interesting. So
Animated.
yeah, animated. Exactly. Excited. So trilogies. Let's think about that. I mean, when I think of trilogy, I think, of course, of Greek tragedy, but also, I think of triptychs. Painters, maybe paint on 3 panels. It's called a triptych.
Right.
I think of films by Lars von Trier. I think of Beckett's trilogy, even though he didn't like to use the term trilogy. But 3 of his novels basically are often grouped together as a trilogy. Burroughs wrote a couple of trilogies, the Cut Up trilogy and the Red Knight trilogy. And actually, I may have an ulterior motive here because I, as a singer-songwriter, have written what I call a Far East trilogy. My musical project, features 3 albums. There's a Japan album, a Korea album, and a Taiwan album. And I
Nice.
call these 3 albums the Far East trilogy. So what is it about trilogies that, why throughout cultural history, literary history, musical history, why is it so convenient to group works into trilogies?
I was also thinking of like Trinity, right? In a way, Father, Son, Holy Spirit.
Well, yes, true. Is there something archetypal about 3?
I don't know. Because obviously, we got duality and dualism being super crucial as well. So I'm not sure. We know 3's a crowd. That sounds kind of trite, but I don't have.
And 3's company.
That's true. I don't know what I can necessarily add about trilogies being particularly significant. I think you should continue and maybe talk about what they mean to you.
Oh, shit. I was hoping you could help me out of this hole because I don't really know either. Maybe, doing 2, if you have 2 works, it's like not enough. So you need a 3rd. Of course, there are also tetralogies, right? With 4 works or more. Maybe we need 3 at a minimum to keep it interesting.
I'm trying to think maybe in terms of if you see the 3 as 1, like basically an extension of 1, and we talk about like a typical like plot mountain, then I don't know. I guess you can call like one the exposition, the second would be like a climax, and the third would be descending action.
Well,
I
yeah.
don't know if
It's like
right?
beginning, middle, end, or a 3-act
Right.
play or something. I just
Right.
think if you're going to take the trouble to create 2 works that are related thematically, you may as well do 3, right? Otherwise, why not just have a standalone work?
I mean, I'm also just thinking though in terms of film. I feel like the third one is often like if it is part of a series, it's often the weakest one, right? It's the one that they're just trying to milk some money out of you.
Oh, I didn't even think about that, but yeah, how about the Godfather trilogy?
Godfather. I feel like they're not coming to mind right now, but many comedies that run for that third, that's the one where they have trouble assigning the main actor, and they just really try to just use the brand name at that point.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, I think I've generally been not very invested in trilogies, maybe just because I often associate them with, I don't know, just the types of genres and films that aren't like my favorite, like whether there's some kind of grandiose action adventure stuff, it's just, or fantasy. But I'm not like saying that those are not valid, but maybe just not my preference. I mean, I don't know. Did you get into like the Lord of the Rings stuff?
I've seen them. Yeah, that was a trilogy, right? There were 3 films.
I think so. And then like Star Wars, I'm not really like a big Star Wars guy either. Again,
Oh,
no
yes, those are
disrespect, but-
organized into trilogies too. I mean, they're what, 9, 12, 15 or something now, but
Yeah.
originally
Yeah.
there were 3, and I think since then the first ones were 4, 5, and 6, and then they went back and did 1, 2, and 3. I don't remember, but yeah, they were organized into trilogies too. I didn't think about that.
Yeah.
But what you said about the third being the weakest, that's certainly true of the Godfather trilogy, isn't it? I mean,
Sure.
number 3 is like a made-for-TV movie,
Right.
with the horrific acting of the director's daughter.
They still got some big names for that third one, didn't they? I don't remember, but
I don't know. Andy Garcia's great in it. I watched it again recently, but
okay.
I don't know. I mean, to be honest, I didn't think that 2 was as good as 1. I know some
Right.
people like 2 better, but I don't know. I just thought 1 was the best, and it's my favorite. But let's save this for another time.
Okay, well, just the last thing I'll say is maybe I think one of the critical things to remember is whether the artists had all 3 in mind when they create the first. Yeah, not even necessarily having it all plotted out, but at least having the vision. Because in film, what we see is like, oh, we made a shitload of money, so why not pump one more out? But if like with Peter Jackson, I think he definitely had the vision. So it's really, you're just seeing the whole thing cut up rather than, okay, let's just, add some more fat to this. So I think, yeah, the original vision is pretty important if we're weighing the value of the art.
You said cut up. That reminds me of Burroughs' Cut Up trilogy, which I mentioned earlier. And I don't know if he planned 3 books in advance or not. I don't remember having read what his intentions were. I've read them all because I'm what I call a completionist. Once I start, if I start a trilogy, I'm going to finish it, unless the first one is just garbage. But I like what he did with the trilogy concept, the Cut Up trilogy, and especially the Red Knight trilogy. Amazing.
Nice.
But
check it out.
yeah. Well, let's get back to Bowie.
Sure.
And Berlin. The Berlin trilogy, it's called, even though, as we will discover when we get into each album, the 3 albums were not even recorded completely in Berlin. I mean, the third album, not at all, right? But
right, I think only one was recorded in Berlin.
Well, Heroes was recorded completely in Berlin. Low, the first album, was recorded partly in Berlin. So
Okay.
it's I think Bowie didn't originally intend to write a trilogy, and it was only once he began promoting Lodger, the third album, that he began to market it as a trilogy, even though, the third one had nothing to do with Berlin, but or at least it wasn't recorded in Berlin. But maybe he felt like all three of them were inspired by his time in Berlin, which was certainly important to his development, and it's my favorite Bowie creative period, so it is significant, but I don't think it was like a preconceived plan. But just as an interesting side note, I took my son on the grand tour. I'll be writing about this too, another travelogue on the way, maybe 2024, but I think it was 2017. We went to Europe, and one of the stops was Berlin, and I took the David Bowie tour, which was a walking tour. We went to various places, went by his old apartment, which he shared with Iggy Pop, and of course went to Hansa Studio, where Part of Low and All of Heroes was recorded, and other albums too, some Depeche Mode albums, U2 recorded there. So it's it's quite a well-known recording studio in pop and rock history.
Nice.
Yeah. So, but I also have another ulterior motive. I'm planning a novel called Station 2 Station. That is Station, the number 2 station, which obviously alludes to a Bowie album, and Bowie's music features prominently in it. But one of the other great themes is repetition and variation, parody, and of course the Stations of the Cross. So all of this is something that I hope readers will look forward to in the coming years.
Very good.
Okay, and one other thing I want to say. I saw Bowie live April 29th, 2004. You can look this up on the internet now.
I know you can find like set lists of everything online, which is cool.
That's how I know the date. I looked it up. I saw him in Houston in the Woodlands, Cynthia Woods Mitchell Pavilion, and the date was April 29th, 2004, which was, like a year before I left the States for Korea. It was a fantastic show. It's the second best concert I've ever seen. Number one being Paul McCartney. But it was incredible. It was a great night. Went with a couple of friends. Wonderful experience. So I'm really pleased that I saw him live before he passed, and he came out.
What kind of show was it?
What's that?
What kind of show was it? Was he highlighting one aspect of his musical career?
I mean, it's in 2004. It's basically a greatest hits performance, or I think they call them like jukebox concerts or whatever. But the band was just fantastic. He was very entertaining. I think he walked out and he said, "Hey, Texas, you crazy motherfuckers," and then he launched into Rebel, and the opening act was the Polyphonic Spree, and they're like, I don't know, I don't know how to describe them. They all wear white robes. I don't think they're active anymore, but they look like a cult, and they have like these big choirs. I think they're from Dallas originally, but they're like neo-psychedelia, and he made some comment about drinking the Kool-Aid with Polyphonic Spree or something. I mean, it was it was a great night. It was really very memorable. I'll never forget that evening with my two friends, hearing
Nice.
this fantastic concert.
I mean, I'm kind of surprised he did like a greatest hits approach, just because from what I've seen about him is that he was pretty stubborn about often only playing new material, or he seems like the kind of guy that would shy away from the commercial aspect of like a greatest hits approach.
Well, I
I mean,
mean,
I get it. Sometimes you give the crowd what they want, but
well, there were some surprises. Like he did the best cover of a song I've ever seen. He did the Velvet Underground's "White Light, White Heat," and it
okay.
was, I mean, it was in a way better than the original. It was great.
And was
Uh,
he doing in like anything with as far as like visual effects or costumes that was remarkable?
uh, I don't know if it was remarkable, but it was, the visual aspect was solid.
Mm.
We were not close, so
Right.
we couldn't see as well as people in the front, but it was I can't fault the visual aspect of the performance, but his catalog is at that time was so vast, and then
Mhm.
he made some good albums after that. But I think in 2004 he hadn't released anything recent. When did I'm Afraid of Americans come out? He played that, and that was awesome. So, he did one or two that were fairly recent like that. And then, in addition, all the hits
That
from the
was
70s and 80s.
1995, by the way.
Oh, I'm Afraid of
Yeah.
Americans, the remix
Uh-huh.
too with Trent Reznor.
Not sure about that.
Yeah, anyway, yeah, maybe a bit, but it was more recent than, some of the hits from the 70s and 80s.
Mhm.
He didn't play Changes, even though I was shouting as loud as I could for him to play it. But
Yeah.
yeah, he didn't do that, but he did Suffragette City, which was incredible. I slapped the chair in front of me so hard, almost broke my hand and the chair. It was great. Yeah,
Nice.
good
Nice.
good
Yeah,
show.
that's
Good
awesome.
show. So let's get into it. Let's start with Low. Tell me your impressions. This is the first time preparing for this episode was the first time you heard Low, right?
Yeah, and I was slightly hesitant with this topic in general, just because I've never really been a massive Bowie person. Not because of any kind of antipathy towards him, but he just hadn't emerged really for me in my life. My sister was a fan of Bowie growing up, and she had, back when AOL instant message screen names were like all the rage.
Mm-hmm.
And I still use my original AOL screen name, which was like West Lava,
Mm-hmm.
right? I still use that sometimes. And hers was I see David Bowie, but like ISEE, David Bowie. So I don't know. I always associated my sister with Bowie, and then she kind of moved from like Bowie to Beck. So I kind of feel like there's maybe some kind of relationship there in terms of
Yes.
innovation
Yeah.
and transformation.
Mutations.
But
That's a
yeah,
That's a
exactly.
Beck album. A very
Yeah, I like
good
that
Beck album.
Yeah. So anyway, that's the background, just to saying that I've heard some hits, obviously, but never dove into an album before. And so of the three albums I listened to, first of all, I gave Low more time than the other two, so that could be why I like it the most. But even with that, I still feel like it's the best in terms of my aesthetic tastes. Just feels more catchy in some way. Not catchy in a pop sense, but I don't know, cleaner. I think electronic sounds usually appeal to me, and I feel like it's the most electronic-y, most kind of stripped down, it's dark. It's darker than the other two, but it just it feels modern, and it feels like the least kind of. Sorry for not being super articulate, but I want to kind of express what I want to say. Like sometimes rock music to me can sound like a bit mushy, and like you get kind of stuck in the guitar sound. Like it's not that crisp. I like really like crisp sounds that are like separate from other sounds like you would get in electronic music or even like a hip hop beat. They're usually quite like pronounced and punctuated. So what I like about Low is it's like really kind of, it has that very specific sound that's really tight, and it has a real tone to it that feels very consistent compared to the other two albums as well, like a real mood. And I don't know, I think I shared it with Christy, and she said this is like an album you can tell like the close relationship to drugs, and maybe that's true. And it's definitely dark, but
like it's a Coke,
just
like
really
it's
appealing.
A Coke album.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, I really like this album. I think, especially the first half, every track stands out and is catchy, is singable. I think "Breaking Glass" is my favorite song.
Okay, that's a great one.
But
it's my favorite too of the three. I'd have to say Low is my favorite also.
Okay, cool. What stands out for you? Why do you think you like it the most?
Maybe for some of the same reasons you mentioned. Like it is very distinctive. There is something modern about it. Like it's art rock or experimental rock, or maybe it's progressive rock. I mean, it's almost impossible to categorize, but it's like something different from his previous catalog and that of his contemporaries. I think it's a you can hear the transition from the 70s to the 80s, I guess you could say. I mean, you start to hear that in Station to Station, which is the album before, but maybe it's even more pronounced on Low. I recently heard an interview with Brian Eno, whose presence on this album and whose participation in all three albums of the Berlin Trilogy is so crucial, right? But I heard him describe it as basically a really good funk band with electronica and ambient accompaniment. I think that's a pretty good description of what's going on with Low.
Yeah, that's nice.
And in a way,
could be like a definition of the trilogy in a way, right? I mean, because of his participation, if we're trying to figure out what this trilogy means thematically, it could just be Brian Eno.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I don't know. Did he continue to work with Bowie after that? I can't remember if he was involved. I think after the trilogy, we have Scary Monsters. I'm not sure. I don't think he worked with him on that. Let me look that up real quick. That's an interesting question.
Sure.
Scary
what I think I heard is that those were the three primary involvements.
What's that?
I think I heard today that those were the three that he was most explicitly involved with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't think he was around for Scary Monsters. Yeah, I'm not seeing him listed here. But, people don't realize this, but the actual producer was Tony Visconti, who worked with Bowie before and after the Berlin Trilogy. People often think that Brian Eno produced it, but he didn't. I mean, Bowie and Visconti were the producers. But, of course, Eno's participation was essential, and he definitely left his mark on all three records. Although I don't think he was that enamored of Lodger. But I think that description, it's like a funk band with some ambient music and some electronica thrown on top. That in itself is something quite new and interesting. The first time I heard Low, I was just that opening track, Speed of Life. It's so different from anything else, but it's also very
it's great.
funky and danceable too.
Absolutely. It's a great intro.
Uh,
What do you think about the second half of the album?
Well, I was thinking, like, in a way you could say side one is the funk band side, and side two is the ambient music side. It's like, I don't know if you've ever heard Eno's Music for Airports, or
No, I've heard of it.
any of those records. I mean, I'm not sure of the chronology there, but if he was working with Eno, I'm sure he was Bowie. That is, I'm sure he was listening to what Eno had been doing, which is why he wanted to work with him. So that's side two of Low is very much. I mean, the Eno influence is inescapable there. You hear it on side one too, but it's more of a traditional funk band bass, I guess you could say.
Like, if you had an LP of this record, do you think one side would get more spins?
I like both, but I'd probably listen to side one more,
Right. Me too.
But I think some of the instrumental tracks on side two are very beautiful.
Absolutely.
Dark and mysterious and sublime at times.
Yeah, I think it's just it would be good, like, university music, as in, like, when we had more free time to just kind of crash out into a couch and go to some different zones mentally.
Mm-hmm.
But now I think life sometimes, I think we talked about this before, but yeah, life sometimes more requires just something to keep you going through your day.
Yeah. Well, I mean, as you say, side two is more of a zone out kind of trip. But I'm always, when I hear side one, I'm energized. It's like, I don't know, it's like amphetamines or something.
Yeah.
It really amps me up, and in a good
You're
way.
such a wonderful person.
Yeah.
But you got problems.
There you go. You were asking,
good.
well, the concept of sound and vision is very important to me too. Like the idea, I mean, even in a musical sense, right? Like, you were asking about the visual aspect of his concert, and that's always been an important part of Bowie's presentation, sound and vision, right? Like, it's not just four blokes rocking out on stage, but I mean, costumes are important. The visual aspect is crucial to what he does as an artist. So I think sound and vision is it's kind of like his manifesto. He finally clarified what his whole project as a performer was. So that I've always liked that, and when I share my own music, I try to think about the visual aspect too, even if I'm doing like lyric music videos.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it sounds like he's been credited a lot with kind of pushing other artists. Just as MTV was coming out, he was really progressive in his music videos, and so his influence on music videos is massive.
Yeah, for sure. And you were asking about always crashing in the same car.
Mm-hmm.
What were your thoughts about that?
Well, I think I did a little bit of background reading, and just it sounds like, yeah, just repeated. It could be something about addiction, or just not just repeating the same kind of destructive behavior. But I'm not sure.
Well,
What do you think?
there's also that song Repetition on Lodger, it reminds me of that, this concept of repetition, variation. I mean, I always think about Andy Warhol, for whom repetition is so important, right? I recently watched the Andy Warhol Diaries on Netflix, which was interesting, good. I don't know if it's great, but I mean, Warhol was an important influence on me, and I hadn't thought about him in a long time, so it was nice to revisit that. But, he's quoted as saying, painters are always remembered for one painting. In his case, of course, it would be what? The Campbell's soup cans, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he said, rightly so, because really, that's all they ever paint is one picture.
Okay.
It's just repetition, variation. So that I always think about that concept of repetition when I'm listening to Always Crashing in the Same Car. Like artists always write the same book or the same song or paint the same picture.
But it is interesting to say that in the context of Bowie, right? Because like as you'll hear in my dad's interview, which is like as the bonus that we'll tag on to this, like Bowie is the antithesis of repetition in some way, right? I mean, I know we can find ways to say that you could say it's just a copy, but he is distinctive from other artists in this constant, complete reimagination.
Well, as with so many other things, it's not either or, but both and, right? Like it appears that he's a chameleon, always doing something completely different, completely transforming himself. And you can say the same about Warhol or Bob Dylan, But in another sense, he's always painting the same Campbell's soup can, even if it looks like something else, or
I get it, but there are degrees, right? And so, I mean, Bowie's renowned for this particular aspect in comparison to other artists, and just how different he is.
But that in itself is a kind of repetition. If you're always changing, then that's
true.
That's your
true.
gimmick,
Yeah.
right? You're the guy who changes.
Right.
You're the chameleon.
Right. And I will say, like, maybe this is unfair, but there's something about, I mean, he has the, and if I get off topic, let me know, but like, I feel like that's something that isn't as appealing to me about Bowie, is that, he's got like the genre that he called plastic soul, which was kind of like tongue-in-cheek poking fun of himself, apparently. And then I see that he went into some genres that I'm more familiar with later, like jungle and drum and bass. And I don't know, like, I kind of feel, I'm not sure if he's the artist I want to go to for soul music, for example, or is he the artist I want to go to for drum and bass or jungle?
Mm-hmm.
Because you kind of like wonder, like, how
He's not authentic.
Is it-
He's not authentic.
and I don't like accusing someone of that, because whatever, like, if he's making good music, good for him. But I'm just saying, yeah.
Well,
what do you think about that?
I mean, I don't disagree, and this is the criticism of Warhol too, right? Like, there's no substance there. It's all just surface superficiality, and some
Maybe,
of his,
but it seems fresh to me. Like
well,
I
to
haven't seen
me
stuff
too.
like
To
what he
me
does.
too. But that doesn't bother me. I can accept that. Okay, maybe it is all superficiality, but are you sure there's nothing else there? I mean, even if that's like how he wants to present himself. Oh, it's all just surface. That's again, that's something Warhol would say. And this is, we could talk about Bowie and Warhol forever because, they met and Bowie wrote an Andy Warhol song, which Warhol didn't like. And then, Bowie worked with Lou Reed, who was originally Warhol's protege, I guess you could say, or collaborator in the Velvet Underground days. So that there are a lot of interconnections there, and I know Bowie was influenced by Warhol in some ways. But that's the that's the accusation that I would say they've both that was hurled at both of them at different times. Like it's all superficiality.
Well, let me throw.
And and another thing Bowie was accused of is musical vampirism. Like he just steals from everyone and then he throws it all together. I mean, I say, you're asking me how I feel about it. I say, okay, yeah, but I like what he did with it.
Well, right. It all comes down to, does the music stand for itself? I'm just saying, if I wanted to listen to some jungle or drum and bass, I doubt that I'd be checking out a David Bowie album. But maybe that's unfair. I could go and check it out and see if it stands alone.
Well, he as a musical vampire, he's like taking from many different sources, right? Like here, we've got with Low, we've got funk and ambient music. What a combination! That's great. Who did that before? Maybe someone. Maybe he ripped.
But that sounds more
maybe he
fresh
ripped
to
off
me.
someone else. But the way he did it. Yeah. In other words, I don't blame him for being a thief.
No, I just look. I know, for example,
the Beatles
Madonna.
were
She does a lot of
plagiaristic.
shape shifting too,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. There you go, Madonna. There's another example.
But I don't. But that's my point, though. But when Madonna dabbles in some genres that I don't really think she is that invested in, I kind of feel like the actual artists of that genre are often better.
Right.
It's like
She's
sometimes it's like
co-opting
watered
it
down
and,
version.
Yes, appropriating it and watering it down. Sure. But
I don't know if Bowie's doing that because I haven't dipped deep enough. I'm just saying I have like a suspicion. That suspicion.
well, I
comes
think
to
I
mind.
think it's valid. You could say that at times, but most of the time he takes it to a place that I find interesting and fascinating.
Sure.
But
Can I make one
certainly
more
he's doing that.
accusation? Okay, I'm gonna make one more a charge.
Yeah.
And maybe I'm just wondering why Bowie still doesn't really connect with me that deeply, and I think there's a kind of distance that he creates. Maybe it's because of these alter egos. He's obviously a very intelligent guy and incredibly creative, but it's almost, and I'm not. It's not maybe not fair to say that he's not being as vulnerable, but. If I look at his lyrics, he just doesn't seem as direct or accessible as other artists. I mean, you don't get the intimacy that you get with a Beatles song.
Well, I think that's the whole point. I think
yes,
I think that's the whole point. It's all artifice, but
and that's harder to connect to though sometimes.
It's what? What did you say? It's what?
Harder to connect to.
Oh, to connect to. Well, yeah, but I've heard him say in interviews and so on that one of his motivations was to bury the music of the late 60s, And he was accused of that. And he said, "Hey, I just carried out the bodies. It was already dead, and I just, swept the stage clean in a way." What's that?
Which artists specifically would he have in mind when he says he's burying the music of the 60s?
I don't know. Maybe just all the classic rock artists of the 60s. Beatles, Stones, The Who, Hendrix, Cream. Think of Cream. It's three macho guys rocking out, and they're all virtuoso musicians, and then here you have Bowie, this androgynous creature that looks like an alien, or some kind of, you know, Japanese kabuki actor doing some kind of theatrical something with pantomime and you know, strange choreography and
Right.
an emphasis on the visual, and he's playing with gender. You know, that was kind of taboo unless you go back to like Little Richard or something.
Right.
You know, like,
yeah, now that you say that, you're right. Especially in terms of fashion. I mean, he was a clear
yeah.
shift.
Although, you know, Jagger with the Stones was playing with that before Bowie, and Bowie credited him. He said, like, about glam rock, he said, you know, Jagger was the one who taught us all how to be a sort of girlish boy. Or, I mean, if you go back and watch Jagger in the Nicholas Rogue film Performance, that's amazing. And that's a, you know, and actually Bowie worked with that same director on The Man Who Fell to Earth just a few years later. So I think Jagger was doing some of that, and then, you know, of course Bowie took it, you know, to a different place, a more extreme place.
Do you know if Bowie had any?
What's that?
Do you know if Bowie had any kind of relationship with Elton John?
I think Elton John is one of those who called him a musical vampire.
Interesting.
Yeah. It's interesting you mentioned Elton John, actually, because part of Low was recorded at this studio in France called Chateau d'Hérouville, which Elton John nicknamed Honky Chateau, and he even named one of his albums after that. I guess because he recorded it there. So Bowie also recorded at Honky Chateau before moving to Hansa Tone Studio in Berlin.
Okay.
Yeah, and one other, well, actually I've got two other interesting pieces of trivia on Low before we move on. So the album L-O-W, Low, it was parodied by Nick Lowe, L-O-W-E. Nick Lowe is a British singer-songwriter. So L-O-W, his name is L-O-W-E, right? So soon after Low came out, Nick Lowe released an album called Bowie, B-O-W-I.
Okay, nice. That's funny.
Yeah, that's hilarious, isn't it? I mean, how clever to think of that. And did you notice the visual pun on the album cover?
I don't think so.
Low profile.
In what sense?
Look at the cover.
Yeah. The fact that he's in profile, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that was an alternative title that was considered, because the whole idea was to leave, you know, I guess at that time it was L.A., where he almost killed himself, or, you know, coked himself to death. Can we say that?
Right.
And then so he moved to Berlin to keep a low profile, and then, as he said, well, he took Iggy with him, who was recovering from a heroin addiction, and then Berlin ended up being the smack capital of the world. They didn't know that at the time, but that was in retrospect, they thought maybe they picked the wrong place to try to clean up. But the idea was to go to Berlin and keep a low profile there, right? Like in West Germany, I don't think at the time they gave a shit about Bowie, so he could kind of be anonymous, which is what he wanted.
And apparently he was living quite humbly there as well, right? In a very simple flat in a like a meatpacking district with a lot of Turkish immigrants and so on.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
Yeah, that's true too. I didn't go in, but on that walking tour, I saw the neighborhood. I'm sure it's different now, but there was a white apartment building, and there's a blue sign out there marking the spot. One other thing, at this time, Tony Visconti was married to a female singer named Mary Hopkin, who sings backing vocals on Sound and Vision, actually. And
Okay.
she was a Welsh singer, fairly well known for her version of the song "Those Were the Days," produced by Paul McCartney,
Nice.
and she was signed to
I have
Apple
one
Records.
piece of
I
I have one piece of trivia for you as well, which was kind of interesting that I heard in an interview with Tony. How do you say his name? Tony
Visconti, yeah.
So he was just saying that the way that they recorded it at that time was just so different from today. Like they had whatever number of tracks, like 24, I think, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But they only had space for one for the vocal, and on certain tracks with Bowie, and they never kept previous takes. So like each time, if Bowie said he can do a better take, in a sense there was a risk, because like in today's recording, if you can use any take, right? Everything's been recorded.
Yeah,
and you
yeah.
can even use parts of takes.
Yes.
But at that point, it's like you only kept one take, and if you decided to do another take, you lost all previous takes, and so it's kind of like that was just interesting for me to imagine. And but Bowie would pump himself up, and he would always be able to like produce a better take.
I didn't know about that, or I don't remember hearing about that, but I do know that he would record one line at a time. So maybe he would, know in advance what the best take, when he was ready to deliver the best take for that line, then they'd have that line down and he'd go to the next line. And often he was writing the lyrics in the studio too, which I mean, I would never want to work that way, but I know he did that with his vocal tracks. But the instrumental tracks came first, which that's the way I record too. It's like you get the instrumental tracks down first, then you record the vocals over that, and the instrumental tracks are recorded live. You got the band in the same room, or at least drums, bass, and guitar. Record that together live, and then you can go add other parts later. And he was I think he was a pioneer in that respect.
Cool.
And that that band, that funk band, with Carlos Alomar on guitar and these other guys, that the bassist is incredible as a bass player. I'm very impressed by this guy. George Murray is his name, and I don't know what else he played on, but he's a great musician. And Dennis Davis on drums. I think he played on all three albums too. So Carlos Alomar worked with Bowie for many years, before the Berlin Trilogy, after, in the later part of Bowie's career. I don't think he was around, but he was basically the band leader for many years. And then, there would be different guest lead guitarists, but the core of musicians for a while, for a good, decade or more, was led by Carlos Alomar.
Okay. Shout outs to Carlos.
There you go. All right, let's move on to Heroes, since we're closing in on an hour here. Tell me your impressions of Heroes. This is your second favorite of the three? I have the feeling you didn't love Lodger, but
again, like I'm also ranking them in the order of how much I listened to them, so I feel like it's still early days, you know. And that's often the sign of the best music, is the music that takes a little bit longer to get into. So I don't have anything really great, profound to say. I like, of course, Heroes is iconic, and but I also feel like it's so deeply cemented in pop culture that I don't know how much I can say about it that's particularly fresh. I will say the line that kind of like tripped me out for a little bit in Heroes is just the idea that like nothing will keep us together. You know, like for a while I was like, am I hearing that right? Just
Yeah.
Because I was just imagining this to be this super triumphant song, and then it has that line, which is obviously like kind of highlighting separation. I mean, it's not so heroic to not be kept together, right? Unless it's just one short peak that he's describing.
Just for one day.
Right.
And I'm sure you noticed Heroes is in quotation marks, right?
Mm-hmm.
Why is that?
That's true. I didn't think about that, but perhaps I should have. I kind of just thought it was like just a punctuation thing, you know?
Yeah.
So you mean specifically, like, as opposed to the other tracks on the album, this one is in
Well,
quotations?
the album title is in quotation marks.
Right.
So why is that? That's not, you know, he's clearly using it almost ironically. I mean, there's something about marking it with quotation marks like
sure,
that.
No,
Yeah.
Absolutely, 100%. And I think it kind of falls into that category of songs like Born in the USA, which are like co-opted for high school graduations or sports events, right?
War rallies.
Right, but like Heroes, right? But it's, yeah, so that's interesting that it kind of joins songs like that in that realm of maybe being misinterpreted.
Well, I mean, this is maybe the most obviously Berlin-centered track in the trilogy, right? There's reference to the wall, and the studio is right by where the wall was. You know, you go there today, you can see where the wall was, and there's reference to it, right? And I think Visconti talked about how they were in the studio and they'd look out and I think they saw a couple kissing by the wall or something, and that was
right.
That was
and
the
I think
inspiration.
he actually had a relationship. Yeah, Bowie had a relationship with that guy who had this lover. I heard something about that. So this guy that Bowie knew was having an affair with some lady, and I'm not saying that in a way that's really really illustrative, but
well, that was
anyway.
that was the inspiration for the lovers in the song, you know, allegedly.
Mm-hmm.
Although in later years there was a woman in the UK that filed suit against Bowie, claiming that he ripped off the lyrics to Heroes from her notebook. She didn't win; it was thrown out,
Nice.
I think. But I always thought. I remember the first time I heard it, I thought the imagery of the dolphins was just so incredible. You don't hear that in a pop song, you know.
right.
That's very.
There's no doubt. Like the level of lyrics sophistication is very impressive.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like V2 Schneider. It's catchy. And Secret Life of Arabia.
That's great. I love the hand claps on that.
Yeah, it's but you should continue to talk about this album more than I should, because again, I think that the album has significance, a lot of significance for you.
Well, less than low, but sure. I mean, Heroes is great. You mentioned V2 Schneider. Yeah. That's his homage to the music of Kraftwerk or Kraftwerk.
Right.
And I think,
And isn't it also like? Doesn't it also mean like a type of bomb or something? Right? It's some kind of military meaning.
yeah,
The
it's a
V2 Schneider.
rocket. You know,
Right.
the Nazis had like a V2 rocket program in development, which is the one of the themes of the Thomas Pynchon novel. What's it called? Gravity's Rainbow.
Mm-hmm.
I think the use of the koto, that Japanese instrument on Moss Garden, is incredible, fantastic. Sense of Doubt on side 2, very ominous,
Mm-hmm.
dark,
Yep.
beautiful music. I mean, again, like with Low, you've got standard rock songs on side 1, and then side 2, it's more instrumental. You know, it's more like and of course Eno is still involved, so it's like for each of those records he told Eno, okay, it's your turn to play around here.
It's interesting because I've read that Bowie is the best-selling vinyl artist of the 21st century. I don't know, just in terms of the vinyl, I think that the way of like distinguishing these two sides of albums is like very convenient, right? So it's like you flip it and then you've got this type of music. So it's kind of a cool way to imagine it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's like you got radio-friendly or somewhat radio-friendly hits on side 1, and then
Right.
side 2 is for the art rockers.
Exactly.
Although, you know, The Secret Life of Arabia is a great rock song of under 4 minutes, so that could just as well be a radio-friendly tune.
Sure.
And some of the others on
Sure.
side 1 are kind of proggy or experimental or art rocky, if we can use that term.
I will say though, just like for my own temperament, and obviously that's hugely subjective, but some of these more ambient tracks, if they were a bit more dancey, like if they had a consistent like house beat to them, I feel like it's kind of silly saying that, but I feel like I would like them more because it would have more of like a positive thrust and be a bit less droney.
Mm-hmm.
But that's just my own preference.
Yeah, well, again, that might be the Eno influence. Like, you're not going to do
Right.
much dancing to his music from airports. Or is it
Right.
music for airports? Whatever. I mean, it's
Yeah.
it's like, that's just a completely different genre.
Mm-hmm.
So, of course, it's not for everyone. But the other thing I'll note about Heroes is the use of sax. I mean, there's some really discordant, crazy sax on, for example, Neukölln on side 2. Just some...
And that reminds me of Pink Floyd too. I shouldn't say two, but that reminds me of Pink Floyd.
Well,
the use of horn.
Well, okay, but his sax is more like, you know, avant-garde jazz or noise rock sax, whereas on most Pink Floyd albums, the sax is, you know, more like melodic, I guess,
Okay.
or
okay.
more integrated into the arrangements.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, in terms of instrumentation, and Bowie was a Pink Floyd fan, especially early Pink Floyd with Syd Barrett.
Nice.
What else do I want to say? Oh, with Heroes, we've got... Okay, so the funk band is still there with Alomar and company. Eno is still around. Visconti is still producing. But you've got the guest lead guitarist, Robert Fripp, the prog rock guitarist of King Crimson fame. And this is another key aspect of the Berlin Trilogy, this use of these really avant-garde rock artists, like this is not, I don't know, this is not like bringing Eric Clapton into the studio to play on your record. He's not going to give you just some standard blues rock guitar. Robert Fripp is doing crazy things, and this is the kind of collaborator Bowie wanted. And then later on Lodger, and actually before that on the tour for Low and Heroes, he picks up another King Crimson alumnus, Adrian Belew, the Wang Bar King, who is also into sonic experimentation.
Nice.
Yeah. So the experimental art rock, avant-garde aspect of the Berlin Trilogy is an important part of it, and it's one of the things I admire, this willingness to experiment, to try whatever. I mean, how did he end up putting a koto on the album? It's kind of like what we talked about with Björk. She had an interest in Inuit vocalists, so she just invited one to the studio. That's very much the way Bowie operated, at times. Koto, great, let's put it on this track.
Yeah, he seemed very principled. Right.
Yeah. I mean,
there's definitely a lot of art. Yeah, he's got a very pure vision that he wants to fulfill, and he wants to. Yeah, he's interested in like creativity is obviously like a high principle for him.
Sure.
Relentless creativity. And fearless creativity.
Yeah. Well, I mean, he talked about how he felt like he abandoned that in a way in the Let's Dance period, and he felt like he got too commercial. Oh, well, the success of Let's Dance led to him doing a couple of commercial albums, which, I don't even know if I've heard them in their entirety, like Tonight or whatever. I've heard it, but they're kind of forgettable. And he basically said the same thing. Although Let's Dance, certainly has its moments. But speaking of repetition, the Heroes album, which is so iconic, it was repurposed on his next to last album called The Next Day, which is actually a very good late Bowie album. I listened to that when it first came out. I liked it a lot. But the album cover for The Next Day is basically the Heroes cover with The Next Day plastered over it. So it's like The Next Day is, if you want to interpret the album cover, you could say that The Next Day is always conscious of the past. Tomorrow is a result of all of the yesterdays that have preceded it. And today, I guess you could say.
Right. You can't have one without the other. They're just inextricably linked.
But that's like, this idea that the artist always paints the same picture,
Right, sure. I'm looking at the cover that you mentioned, by the way. Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah. I mean, it's almost like he paid someone to make that cover, but apparently they put a lot of thought into it, and that...
Of course,
and
yeah.
That's it's like, it's Bowie, but it's not Bowie, which I think is always, it's always both and, just like with a Warhol painting, it's instantly recognizable, you know who it is, but something different, like it's always the same, always different, as John Peel said about the music of The Fall. Okay, well, we're starting to ramble.
I am reflecting, though, as we go on, like that's okay, no, I'm reflecting on my own tastes, and I just feel like, this again is like why I gravitate towards certain type of writers that are more like emotionally open, and now I'm able to see this is kind of why Bowie maybe hasn't been my mainstay, because I am seeing that Yeah, he's got a tension, and that's fine. It's we need all things, but
Well, I think
even the writers that you mentioned, like a Pynchon, I feel like that's the type of writer who isn't my favorite.
right.
But there's an aspect of
And maybe that's just a phase I'm going through. Although it's it's like a 2 or 3 decade long phase at this point. But I like artists.
Well, we live many lives anyway, right? So each life is just a phase.
I like artists who play with masks and like Pessoa with his heteronyms, right? He creates these different. He said that he was many different authors. He assumed these different personalities. Like each book he actually claimed was written by a different person, one of his heteronyms, and not Fernando Pessoa. So there's some of that in Bowie and Dylan, and for some reason I think a lot of Philip Roth too. Like you could say that every book Roth ever wrote is the same book, but it's always different too. It's always the same, always different. Repetition, variation, variation, repetition.
Well, that comes back to what you were thinking about with the overcoat, or just like the copying, right? And you said that was like the writer.
Yeah. Yes.
That?
Yeah.
So
like there was that Burroughs quote I cited. I misquoted it, but it's something like all writers are rewriters. They're rewriting previous texts. So I want
to ask you something that may or may not be interesting, but obviously Bowie's mother's side of his family had all these issues with schizophrenia.
Oh, yes.
And Liliana, just when I was telling her about Ziggy Stardust, she said, like, do you think alter egos are manifestations of schizophrenia? And I was like, no, because schizophrenia is like uncontrolled multiple personalities, whereas like alter ego or alter egos are much more like decisive, creative decision.
Well, it's a defense against it, I guess you could say. It's a defense against schizophrenia. I know that was one of his fears. I mean, I've got here on my desk the Bowie bio, Strange Fascination by David Buckley, which Bowie denounced. Mm-hmm. But, I think it's a good source book. But his brother, as you may have learned from your research, committed suicide. He jumped out of the window of I think he was institutionalized, and he may have been schizophrenic too. And as you say, there were, people in the family that had issues with it. So Bowie was always worried about that, which is why I don't think he ever got into psychedelics or, I don't even know if he was ever into pot, like he was a coke guy and he drank some, but he was scared of that, which, schizophrenics or people who are prone to schizophrenia have to be wary of psychedelics. This is what they think fucked up Syd Barrett, speaking of Pink Floyd, right? Like he just took too much acid and his schizophrenia, it like triggered his schizophrenia. And Bowie certainly was aware of his story. He's you asked about the 60s burnouts, that's one right there, Syd Barrett. So I think that was kind of an object lesson to Bowie, like, I don't want to be like this guy, and I think I have some of the same predilections. So as a defense, maybe you could say he took on these various personae. I mean, of course,
That's an interesting interpretation.
What's that?
That's an interesting interpretation, that alter egos are defense against
I think,
schizophrenia.
that's what I would say. I mean, when you raise that issue, that's the thought I had. And it's, same for Pessoa, same for anybody,
By the way, that is pretty funny that you mentioned William Buckley, right? After our Ginsberg episode.
No, David Buckley. David Buckley.
Ah, David Buckley. I'm sorry. I was like, really?
No. David Buckley is a British biographer. It's not William.
Okay, my bad.
William fucking Buckley. No.
I was like, wow, he really ventured out.
A Bowie fan? No, I don't think so. I don't think so.
Okay.
No.
Okay.
No, this is I don't know if he's written anything else. I think he's like a Bowie super fan, and then he wrote a bio which his hero, in quotation marks, didn't approve of.
Right.
That must have been devastating for him. But it's it's a very good source book from beginning to end. Like I learned most of what I know about Bowie from this bio, as well as documentaries and interviews. Okay.
Right.
Let's finish with Lodger here. So
Okay.
you were talking about how some people dispute, what the actual trilogy consists of. Some people want to say, well, actually, Iggy Pop's "The Idiot" is one of the albums in the trilogy, because at least that was,
Right.
composed, and was it recorded in Berlin too? Certainly they were working on it together, but
I mean, what I read too is that Iggy Pop said David Bowie basically did everything on that album, in terms of production and instrumentation.
he did a
so-
lot. He did a lot. Yeah, I mean,
Right.
actually, yeah, that's another episode unto itself, Bowie and Iggy. But I think, again, it doesn't seem like this was conceived as a trilogy. I think he sort of got that idea when he was promoting Lodger. But again, Eno's
Right.
there, and I think you're right that his constant presence on all three albums, that's important. And you've got the core funk band with Carlos Alomar. But this time we have a new guitarist, as I mentioned before, Adrian Belew, who was on the tour for Low and Heroes. So, there was Low and Heroes were like released in the same year, I think. They were both released in 1977, which is incredible. He did those two albums in 1 year, or he may have started working on them before that, but he did. I mean, he recorded Low in 1976, but two albums came out in the same year of 1977. And then he toured, right? And on the tour, Adrian Belew was in the band, and then they brought him into the studio for Lodger, which is in many ways quite different, because you don't have that ambient music quality, right? It's more of like a world music vibe, I would say, which I like. I listened to Lodger again recently, and I really like it. Many great songs on it. What are the highlights for you?
I think I'm gonna plead the fifth on this, because I just haven't given it enough
But
focus.
you sent me a text alluding to DJ.
Yeah, I guess that's a good point. I was singing along yesterday on the bus to the second half of that album. So DJ,
Look Back in Anger. Yeah, that's great.
Boys
Keep Swinging. Awesome. Boys Keep
By
Swinging.
the way, I did think about like there's like the Oasis song, like Don't Look
Of
Back in
course,
Anger.
yeah.
Is that a reference?
Well, there's that John Osborne play, Look Back in Anger, and I assume Bowie is alluding to that, and then who knows what Noel Gallagher had in mind when he wrote Don't Look
Right.
Back in Anger. I mean, he's just trying to copy the Beatles, and he probably remembers a Bowie lyric, or who knows, maybe he's riffing on the John Osborne play, although I tend to doubt it. But yeah, I mean, that, no disrespect to that song, that's a good song, the Oasis song, but yeah, Look Back in Anger is a wonderful track. Boys Keep Swinging. What they did on that track, this is maybe like the influence of Eno. Eno developed this card deck called Oblique Strategies, and instead of like picking a tarot card or casting the I Ching or whatever, you pick one of his Oblique Strategies card, cards if you're stuck creatively. I've never seen the deck, but I know the cards say things like try faking it. So if you're stuck, and you pick a card, you get some advice like try faking it. Oh, okay, I'll do that. And then whatever it is, you just go with it, So they were using some of that serendipitous chance, work process on this album.
Here's
Process.
a funny reference I just found for you that you'll probably enjoy. It says, references, this is from Wiki, references to oblique strategies exist in popular culture, notably in the film Slacker, in which a character offers passers-by cards from a deck. So, Richard Linklater.
Oh, there you go. Is it, but not the oblique strategies card, right? Not that deck,
No, I think
just
it's
like a regular card deck.
No, it's
it is
strategies.
oblique strategies, okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I should get a deck actually because I've never seen like the complete deck. Now that you mention it, we were talking about Warhol earlier. I saw like an Andy Warhol card deck in the bookstore a few months ago. Like different.
Nice.
So it's kind of like oblique strategies. Like whatever card you pick, it's some Warholian archetype. I mean, yeah, divination is sometimes an important part of my process too. So I should get this oblique strategies deck just out of curiosity. But apparently they were using it, and maybe that's relevant to Boys Keep Swinging because what they did was everyone played a different instrument. Like Carlos Alomar is on drums. I don't know, somebody else is on guitar. I mean, Bowie's singing, of course, but like everyone had to play an instrument with which they weren't, which wasn't their primary instrument.
Right. That's crazy.
But the results, I mean, that's one of the best tracks on the album. I love it. But that's how it came about. I mean, amazing.
Yeah, that's super cool.
And, the line from Red Sails is unforgettable. The hinterland, we're gonna sail to the hinterland. It's so far, 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 far away. Great line.
I wanted to know, in any of your gigs, have you ever covered Bowie? And if so, like which
Sure,
tracks?
yeah, we did China Girl, actually, which...
Okay, somehow I guess that would be
we did
the song that you chose.
We did it in Korea, and it was, I think we called it Korea Girl, which is pretty silly. But yeah, that's an Iggy Bowie track. Mm-hmm. Originally, it was on one of those Iggy albums. It's basically an Iggy song, but... of course, Bowie was involved. There are a lot of there's the song repetition here, but then a lot of the songs have like counterparts. Fantastic Voyage uses the same chord structure as Boys Keep Swinging, actually, and then there's Red Sails at the end of side 1 and Red Money at the end of side 2.
Okay, interesting.
But yeah, since you're less knowledgeable about this one, maybe this is a good place to stop. We're coming up on 1 hour and 20-something minutes, so maybe we should wrap it up. Any final thoughts?
A couple other things. I don't know if you want to... Yeah, well, just a couple things. Like, do you want to say anything about his... I know my dad's going to get into this in the postscript, but...
Oh, shit. When we add that, we're going to be
about...
over an hour and a half. This is the longest episode ever, people.
Do you want to say anything about sexuality in terms of Bowie? I mean, I watched this documentary, right? And he, like, at one point, he very explicitly comes out and says, "I'm gay," and then later on, he espouses to be like a purely heterosexual. And both of the statements are kind of ridiculous in some way because, like, this need to, but. The "I'm gay" statement is more interesting, I guess, because of the time period.
Well, example. yeah, at the time, that was quite a provocative thing to say. But when he said it, he was with Angela Bowie. I don't know that he was married to her, but, you know, he's saying he's gay, but he's bi.
Right.
Whatever. I mean, those labels, that's like one of the least interesting things to me. But I'm glad that he...
I mean, in terms of sexuality at the time, though, it's pretty... Like, you know, as my dad gets into, if you weren't like... if you weren't a guy who identified maybe so strongly with the masculine aspect, or if you were interested in... Yeah, just if you didn't have that direct link to macho culture, and you just were feeling maybe a bit feminine or insecure in some way. He just talked about how liberating Bowie's image was, right? and
I praise him for that. I mean, that's a great...
So in that sense, I'm saying that's like pretty bold.
No, that's a great thing that he did. But as I say, there were predecessors. You know, Jagger was playing with that to some extent, and before that, Little Richard. I mean, who was Bowie's first musical idol? I mean, he talks about how as a kid he dreamed of running away and finding Little Richard and playing saxophone in his band, you know, like, so that's pretty awesome. That's a huge influence there, and he's kind of like bringing that back into the mainstream, because like we talked about that, you know, like those macho kind of rockers of the late 60s. I mean, he did an amazing thing, a necessary thing, a great thing, when he,
right.
You know, well, all the things he did, saying the things he did, you know, appearing in a dress on The Man Who Sold the World. That was, at the time, that was quite a revolutionary thing to do. And I mean that in the etymological sense, it's like a reclaiming, a returning to the past, because that was, you know, part of rock and roll in the earliest days with Little Richard.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I'm just saying, like, I'm not really interested in
the music is right.
Whom he actually fucked or what gender he actually fucked, but it's more about like his public pronouncements and the way he played with it, you know.
And maybe even seeing sexuality as another field for creativity, right? Because if you're someone who's exploring yourself in every way, you kind of maybe even want to push yourself in
Absolutely.
that way. I mean, I'm just trying, you know
yeah.
what I mean? Like,
well, and David Byrne of Talking Heads, who I think inducted Bowie into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, in that induction speech, he talks about how rebellion... He talks about Bowie as rebel and like artificial rebel, and how rebellion is sometimes artifice, and artifice can sometimes be rebellion. You know, that's something that I feel I learned from Warhol and Bowie around the same time of my life, like in my late teens. Like, so earnestness is not always the most deep and profound attitude, you know? Like, sometimes a certain artificiality is actually more profound, deeper than a sincerity which can also be kind of artificial, you know? Like, if you take sincerity too far, it becomes artificial too. Now, of course, artifice can be also empty, right? But sometimes it's both. Sometimes the emptiness reveals a kind of depth and profundity that you didn't know was there. And like the wearing of masks, which is what artificiality is in a way, right? Like this wearing of masks, you could say it's superficial and artificial, but doesn't isn't it possible to reveal a deeper truth that way? Like, you're connecting with an archetype, or if we're talking
sure.
about the art of Warhol, like his images of celebrities, these are basically religious icons for the secular age,
Right, yeah. I liked that. I think I watched the same episode, so yeah, that was brought up there.
Well, but
That
it's
was interesting.
obvious, right? Even if you don't watch that episode.
Yeah, no.
That's clearly...
Sure.
I mean, the influence of Catholicism and Catholic, church art on Warhol is undeniable. It's just so obvious. But it looks almost cartoonish, artificial, but you're connecting with some kind of deep archetypal force, I think. And when you put on a mask, you're doing that, or you can be doing that. I mean, even
Sure,
I don't know if you are interested in like Killing Joke. That's probably not to your taste, but Jazz Coleman, when he performs, he often, even to this day, he's probably 60 now, but he still like paints his face, like he puts on war paint, because there's a ritual aspect to the performance, and so you transform yourself into something almost superhuman or inhuman, or you connect with some primal elemental archetypal force. That's very powerful.
Sure.
Okay, well,
I hear you. No, I mean, I hear you. I dressed in drag in Korea, and it was very liberating. So
I did too. I made that video that I think you saw, and I remember I went to parties with makeup on. I had never done it before. Actually, I went to a Halloween party as David Bowie by someone's request. Someone asked me to come as Bowie, so I actually, put on makeup for the first time in my life. I mean, I still look pretty butch, but I had like makeup on, and I went into a Pyeongcham, a convenience store, and I very much offended the macho guy behind the counter. He said, he was.
So it wasn't a K-pop type of Korean.
What's that?
So it wasn't.
Oh yeah, he wasn't one of the boy
image of androgyny
band fans. But I mean, yeah, I remember I was highly self-conscious at first. I was like, oh shit, people are looking at me. But then I was just like, yeah, so yeah, it is liberating. Yeah. You realize it allowed me to, like, it's like, why am I so attached to this particular presentation of myself, right? Like there's something limiting about this egotism. Like, this is my identity. This is who I am,
Right.
But putting on the just
Sure.
the simple act of putting on makeup and changing my look a little bit, it's like, whoa, who am I really? And who cares? And like, what does it matter? Is it necessary to define myself so precisely?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. On that note.
Cool. So I think we have Dostoevsky coming next.
Okay.
I could be wrong, but I believe we have the famous excerpt from my favorite Dostoevsky novel, The Brothers Karamazov.
Mine too.
And it's entitled The Grand Inquisitor, and it's a heavy discussion on the existence of God. So should be fun. Should be
more Russian literature.
Yeah.
We
need it right
your
now.
Handlers at the
in these bleak
Kremlin
times.
demanding that? Is that the condition of your being
Bro.
granted a visa? We have to talk about Russian lit again after the overcoat.
I've been shifting around titles of our podcasts. I called our last podcast about abortion, I titled it Give Me Liberty or Give Me Death.
I thought you called it Masturbation
Originally, and I
is
liked
Murder.
that title. I thought it was kind of clever. Well, anyway,
No,
so
you called it.
I originally called it Give Me Liberty
Masturbation is Murder,
right.
right?
Well, I called it that in the recording process just for you and I. But then, like on my first post, I said "Give Me Liberty or Give Me Death," which I thought was like kind of clever. And then now everything that I'm doing, I'm interpreting through the lens of the border officials, the customs officials. So I'm seeing that, and I'm like, they're gonna think that I'm coming there as this like massive activist who's like ready to give everything. So I changed it to like just the abortion, just the topic of the essay. It's pretty sad actually how I'm getting into the fear state of mind.
Yeah,
right
don't
now.
overthink that.
Yeah, but fear is the mind killer.
Agreed.
That's a quote from Dune.
From whom?
So, all right, from I think it's from Dune.
Oh, okay.
You know
I
Dune,
do.
right? The book.
I do know Dune.
Yeah, famous line. Yeah. Okay. All right, people. If you made it this far, we're gonna send you a T-shirt.
Your old Bowie T-shirt.
Oh man, yeah, which Liliana dared to consider throwing away, and I told her, "Do you know?" That was my most intimate experience with Bowie for many years. Was just having this awesome T-shirt. But anyways, all right. Peace and
Until
love.
next time.
Ciao.
Texting.
Hey guys, so I'm here with my dad, Guy Bethel, and he grew up listening to Bowie and being a fan. So just going to chat with him a bit about his impressions of Bowie, and perhaps they'll resonate with some of you. So let's start by asking Dad, what does David Bowie mean to you?
Okay, Bowie means to me infinite creativity, colours, and through much of his career, an ability to completely transform himself from one album to another in a way that was always interesting and engaging. I mean, I haven't listened to all of his work all through the years. I mainly listened to him in his early kind of prime, I guess. All the Hunky Dory and Man Who Sold the World and Ziggy Stardust and all that kind of stuff. But I've listened to him throughout the years, particularly his... he's very... the melodies are strong. There's so much of Bowie stuff is eminently danceable. But listening to him as an adolescent and student, it was he had a way of like appealing to adolescent angst. He also was. I think helped with if you had some kind of anxiety about your sexuality, it was kind of liberating. What came out of Bowie, the overtones of bisexuality, and he's also maybe the first artist, mainstream artist, who came up with any songs that were actually out and out about gay relationships, so he was. It was very sort of liberating in that way. And diminished the anxieties that a young person might have about sexuality. But he was always colourful, always interesting, and the amount of, memorable melodies, I mean, throughout the years, the early stuff and going right through to the end, really. And many of the songs, of course, incredible videos, much more interesting and broader than some of the mainstream artists that we all know. I mean, I guess we're going to talk about that, but if you compare them with someone like the Rolling Stones were always kind of the Rolling Stones. Someone like Mick Jagger, not an awful lot of a huge range. It's always Mick Jagger. Whereas Bowie was quite often a different personality from album to album. So very colourful, very creative, just amazingly talented artist.
Interesting. Thanks. Do you have any personal experiences? Like, for example, can you remember when you first heard him, or how old you were during his peak years? Anything that can kind of give it a more personal flavor.
I listened to him, I guess, mainly in my student years. And I remember having I didn't actually buy many of his albums, but I did have an audio cassette. For those folks that remember audio cassettes, I had an audio cassette of Man Who Sold the World, and I played it in my car driving around. I think I probably wore the thing out. I never actually got to see him. I regret that. But one of my close friends had seen him perform in the days when he was doing colleges. So he saw him perform at the London School of Economics back in the 70s. But he's one of the people I really would have liked to see. He does a great show. And so it's one of my regrets, I guess, as far as seeing performances.
So you referenced Mick Jagger and the Stones earlier. Could you expand on that a little bit and maybe say where you would place Bowie in comparison to other British rock icons that everyone's familiar with? Maybe the Beatles, the Stones, or something a bit more abstract like Pink Floyd?
I'd class him more with Pink Floyd than with the Beatles or the Stones, because Beatles, fantastic music, relatively short career, not that many phases that they went through, although they did go through dramatic phases. The Stones, I mean, the longevity of the Stones is just an amazing, and also the Stones more rooted in a particular musical tradition, and bringing American music into American black music to the mainstream, which you can't really credit Bowie for. Also, the Stones, a collection of individuals. Bowie, you are never really aware of the people who backed him up, apart from one or two people like Mick Ronson. But otherwise, he was always front and center. That's not bad. I mean, many of the other greats, you think of them mainly. You don't think of who's playing with them. So he has the longevity of the Stones, and a much greater breadth of content.
Great. Would you like to mention any standout Bowie songs for you?
Well, I've always enjoyed the danceable songs like "Let's Dance." One that certain Bowie tunes will come back into my mind. There's things that are earworms, I guess, that get stuck in your mind, keep coming back in again. For years I used to find myself singing Jean Genie. I don't know why, but that was a song that stuck with me. I really like the song "The Young Americans," "Heroes," "Let's Dance." Those are the ones that come to the forefront. And of course, Ziggy Stardust, the title track of that album, always fun to listen to.
Great. I'm not super familiar with Bowie's filmography, but I am aware that he dabbled in film throughout his career. Have you seen any films that starred Bowie, and what did you make of him generally as an actor? The one that I guess I remember most clearly is Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence, which is set in World War II in a Japanese prisoner of war camp. He's one of the prisoners of war. And it was powerful and fairly conventional, you could say, but it was a very strong performance. I know the film "Man Who Fell to Earth," although, funnily enough, I'm not sure if I've actually sat through the whole film. But those are the ones that he's probably best known for. Great. And before we finish, do you want to leave us with maybe one final impression of Bowie and his legacy?
Well, I would say one thing about Bowie when he came out as a mainline artist was that he introduced a note of sexual liberation, and diversity, which none of the other artists who were commercially successful dared to do. And so it's interesting that he had what you'd have to say is a gay love song on one of his first albums, John, I'm Only Dancing, and Bowie was, I guess you'd say, he was omnisexual, he was bisexual. He ended up his life happily married for many years, so as heterosexual, but he was much bolder and brave, you could say, than other artists who actually were gay, like Elton John. I mean, it took Elton John many years to actually come up front and be upfront about his sexuality. So, and I think that the LGBTQ community would recognize the trailblazing role that Bowie played, he was totally free creatively. He was totally free in terms of referring to sexuality. He was just a liberating figure in many respects, I think you'd have to say.
Awesome. Let's end it there. And thanks again, Dad, for joining us on the pod.
You're welcome. Thanks.